Have you ever tried to prove yourself in an argument and then felt the tension linger afterward? You started explaining your point. You carefully presented your reasoning. Maybe you even corrected someone publicly, feeling sure you were right. And in that moment it felt powerful. It felt like control, like you were finally asserting yourself and standing your ground. But a few minutes later, the energy shifted. The room felt colder. Respect quietly slipped away. The conversation that once felt important slowly became exhausting. There is a subtle truth about human nature that people have noticed for centuries. The moment we try to dominate a discussion, we often surrender control instead. Proving we are right can trick the mind into thinking we are winning, when in fact we are fueling tension and resistance. Arguments rarely teach or persuade. They often divide and drain. Real influence doesn't happen in the heat of conflict. It happens quietly, in patience, in observation, in the moments when your mind stays calm, even while others are losing theirs. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." And the moment you begin to understand that principle, the way you engage with conflict, and with life itself, begins to change. Most people believe arguments are about discovering the truth. On the surface, it makes sense. Two people disagree, they exchange ideas, and eventually the stronger reasoning should win. But real conversations rarely follow that pattern. Most arguments are about ego. Someone feels dismissed. Someone senses their status is challenged. Their identity or competence feels threatened. And in that moment, the discussion shifts from understanding to defending. Small cues reveal it. A tightening jaw, a pause before speaking, a subtle change in tone. Pride takes control. Logic retreats. People stop listening for clarity and start listening for weaknesses. The harder someone tries to prove they are right, the less anyone else actually hears them. What remains is tension, subtle resentment, and distance that can quietly grow over time. Think back to your last heated exchange. Maybe it happened at work, at home, or online. At first, the issue seemed small, a difference of opinion, a misunderstanding, or a minor criticism. Then something changed. Voices grew sharper, words became precise, almost like weapons. Instead of asking questions, statements were delivered to corner the other person. Each response carried more emotion. Soon, the conversation was no longer about solving anything. It became about standing ground. Someone needed to be right. Someone needed to avoid looking wrong. By that point, the original issue was rarely resolved. All that remained was friction and an unspoken feeling that something important had been lost. This dynamic has existed for centuries. Observers of human behavior noted how quickly pride enters a discussion, seizing control before reason can intervene. Marcus Aurelius once said, "You always own the option of having no opinion." Most arguments continue because someone feels compelled to defend a position. Stepping back feels unnatural, yet it is profoundly liberating. Releasing the need to prove yourself allows space to observe what is happening. Observation, more than rapid response, restores control. Instead of reacting, you watch. You notice tone, posture, and the subtle emotional currents that guide every word. Arguments escalate because emotion moves faster than reason. The brain treats disagreement as a threat to status or competence. Reaction is almost instantaneous. Logic lags behind. Words are spoken from impulse, not clarity. Seneca once said, "No man was ever wise by chance. Wisdom requires awareness. It demands the discipline to notice what is happening inside your mind before your words leave your mouth. Without it, conversations become automatic reactions. The louder the emotion rises, the weaker reasoning becomes. People stop considering solutions. They focus on winning. Once you notice these patterns, a subtle shift occurs. Instead of reacting to provocation, you begin observing the dynamics at play. You see triggers, pride, and hidden motives behind every statement. You learn to respond deliberately rather than impulsively. Calm observation allows you to create space where insight can emerge. Tense conversations become mirrors, revealing not just the other person's patterns, but your own. Awareness allows engagement without losing control. You can influence without force. Over time, this practice transforms interactions. Validation before argument, observation before reaction, and awareness before engagement slowly reshape the conversation. The person across from you notices your steadiness. Their attempts to provoke are less effective because the usual responses that feed tension no longer appear. You are no longer caught in the emotional cycle of every disagreement. Instead, you guide the discussion quietly, preserving your energy and clarity. People naturally begin to approach you differently. They bring problems rather than arguments, questions rather than challenges. Your influence grows without confrontation because steadiness itself exerts authority. This approach requires no manipulation or deception. It is rooted in presence, patience, and self-awareness. You do not ignore the other person. You simply recognize the futility of certain conflicts and choose where to invest your energy. Aristotle once said, "Patience is bitter, but its fruit is sweet." The bitter patience of observing without reacting eventually produces calm, credibility, and influence. Your presence alone becomes stabilizing. Conversations become constructive rather than combative. Relationships improve not through force, but through consistent restraint and measured engagement. Ultimately, the mastery of conversation lies in choosing peace over victory. Calm steadiness shapes interactions in subtle but profound ways. You are not defensive. You are not reactive. You are steady. Your words carry weight because they are deliberate, not reactionary. Over time, people learn that arguing with you is unproductive. Influence comes quietly, but consistently. The moments you resist the urge to fight become the moments where your control over the conversation and over your own mind deepens. And once this discipline takes root, you notice that life itself begins to move more smoothly, because you are no longer drawn into every unnecessary conflict. If this perspective resonates with you, consider subscribing as a quiet commitment to cultivating calm, clarity, and wisdom in your own life. Each time you engage with this content, you take a deliberate step toward mastering your mind rather than reacting to the world. The deeper issue is that arguments often feel satisfying in the moment. There is a certain rush that comes from delivering the perfect comeback or exposing the weakness in someone else's logic. For a brief moment it can feel like triumph, but that feeling fades quickly. What remains afterward is usually distance. The other person walks away remembering the tension rather than the insight. The irritation that fuels arguments is rarely about the other person alone. It often reveals our own sensitivities, our own insecurities, and the places where our identity feels fragile. When someone challenges those areas, the reaction can feel automatic. But recognizing that reaction is the beginning of freedom. Instead of immediately responding with force, you begin to notice the pattern itself. Once you start seeing arguments through this lens, a different understanding begins to form. Disagreements are not tests of intelligence, they are tests of emotional control. The person who remains calm in the middle of tension usually holds the real advantage. Not because they have stronger opinions, but because they are not being carried away by the emotional current of the moment. Epictetus once said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When someone disagrees with you, the disturbance rarely comes from their words alone. It comes from the meaning your mind assigns to those words. Perhaps it feels like disrespect. Perhaps it feels like rejection. But when you begin separating the event from the judgment, the emotional grip loosens. You can hear criticism without immediately turning it into a threat, and that single shift changes the direction of the conversation. The surprising result is that calmness often carries more influence than forceful arguments ever could. When someone refuses to be pulled into emotional conflict, the entire rhythm of the discussion changes. The tension has nowhere to attach itself. Instead of reacting quickly, the calm person listens, observes, and responds with measured clarity. Over time, people begin to notice that difference. They sense stability in someone who does not rush to defend themselves. They sense strength in someone who does not need to raise their voice to be heard. Slowly, without any dramatic display, the balance of the conversation shifts. Others begin speaking more carefully. The atmosphere softens, and what started as potential conflict becomes something closer to understanding. From that point forward, the question naturally becomes less about proving yourself right, and more about recognizing the deeper reasons we feel so compelled to argue in the first place. The real answer is pride. Most arguments do not begin with complicated ideas or deep disagreements. They begin with something much smaller. Someone questions your opinion. Someone criticizes a decision you made. Someone says something that makes you feel misunderstood, dismissed, or slightly disrespected. It can happen in seconds. One sentence is enough, and almost immediately your mind begins preparing a response. You search for the perfect explanation. Your thoughts start arranging facts and examples. Your heart rate rises just a little. The body tightens in ways you barely notice. In that brief moment, the mind believes it is protecting itself. But something important has already happened beneath the surface. You have accepted the invitation to fight, not with fists, but with words. And once that invitation is accepted, the conversation begins moving in a direction that is very difficult to reverse. This reaction feels natural because the human mind is designed to protect identity. When someone questions your view, the brain often interprets it as a challenge to competence or intelligence. Even a small disagreement can feel like a subtle attack on who you are. That is why responses appear so quickly. The mind rushes forward to defend its position before reason has fully examined the situation. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That observation reveals something quiet but powerful. The words spoken by the other person are rarely the real problem. What truly drives the reaction is the meaning your mind attaches to those words. When you interpret disagreement as disrespect, your emotions rise instantly. But when you see it as information, the situation changes. The same words carry far less weight. This is where discipline begins to matter. Most people react before they even realize they are reacting. The response jumps out automatically, shaped by habit and emotion. Yet there is a small moment between hearing something and responding to it. That moment is almost invisible, but it exists. In that small space lies a surprising amount of freedom. Epictetus once said, "Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens." Your reaction belongs to that small circle of things within your power. When you learn to pause inside that moment instead of rushing past it, the entire direction of a conversation begins to shift. Instead of reacting automatically, you observe the situation as it unfolds. You notice the tone of the other person's voice. You notice your own rising emotions. And for the first time, you begin choosing your response instead of being carried away by it. The disciplined mind does something very different from the reactive mind. Instead of defending itself immediately, it becomes curious. Curiosity is surprisingly powerful in moments of tension. When someone challenges your view, curiosity breaks the expected pattern. Instead of pushing back, you slow the conversation down. You ask a simple question, something like, "Help me understand what you mean," or "Why do you see it that way?" Sometimes you ask what concerns them most about the situation. These questions do not weaken your position. They change the structure of the exchange. Suddenly, the other person is explaining rather than attacking. Their attention shifts away from confrontation and toward clarification. The conversation begins to move in a new direction where understanding becomes possible again. When curiosity replaces defense, the emotional temperature in the room often drops almost immediately. People rarely expect calm questions when they are prepared for resistance. The tension loses momentum because there is nothing to push against. Instead of building a wall between two opposing positions, the conversation opens a small path where both sides can look at the issue together. Seneca once said, "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." Delay does not mean silence forever. It means giving reason the time it needs to catch up with emotion. When you pause long enough to ask a thoughtful question instead of delivering a quick defense, you create space for clarity to enter the discussion. But curiosity alone does not dissolve every conflict. Words are only part of what moves people during disagreements. Beneath every statement lies a feeling that is often far stronger than the argument itself. Someone may speak sharply not because the issue is important, but because they feel unheard. Someone may challenge your idea not because it is flawed, but because they feel their own voice has been overlooked. When irritation appears in conversation, it often reveals emotional currents that logic alone cannot resolve. Recognizing those emotions changes how you respond. Instead of trying to overpower someone with reasoning, you begin noticing what the conversation is really about. Once you begin seeing these emotional undercurrents, your approach becomes more patient. You start listening not only to the words being spoken, but also to the feelings behind them. A person who feels respected becomes far more open to hearing another perspective. A person who feels ignored will often argue harder, regardless of how strong the reasoning against them may be. That is why calm attention can be more effective than forceful persuasion. The goal is no longer to win quickly, but to understand what is actually driving the disagreement. When people sense that they are being heard, their need to defend themselves slowly fades. This shift in perspective transforms the entire nature of disagreement. Instead of rushing to prove yourself correct, you begin observing the conversation as it unfolds. The focus moves from defending your position to understanding the situation. That small change may seem subtle at first, but its effect is profound. The argument loses its urgency. The pressure to respond immediately disappears. In its place appears something quieter and far more productive. A space where listening matters as much as speaking. And once that space begins to open, the conversation naturally moves toward a deeper realization about how emotions shape every conflict that follows. People rarely argue because they are searching for facts or clarity. The assumption that an argument is a search for truth is almost always misleading. Most arguments are driven by something far more basic, the need for validation. Someone feels dismissed, someone feels unheard, someone senses that their perspective, their effort, or even their presence is being overlooked. And the moment those feelings arise, logic quietly retreats. You can lay out facts, present evidence, or construct the most precise argument imaginable, but if the other person feels attacked, their mind shuts down before you even finish speaking. This is why careful attention to emotion is often more important than the content of the argument itself. It is the invisible current that controls the flow of nearly every disagreement, yet it is overlooked by most people who rush to speak before understanding. Imagine a situation where someone you care about or work with says, "You never listen to me." The instinct is almost immediate. You feel a surge to defend yourself, to prove that the accusation is false. "That's not true," you might respond. In that split second, the emotional fire stokes higher. The defense, however justified it may be, does nothing to reduce tension. It only strengthens the perception of opposition. The cleverer approach is different. You respond with calm honesty, acknowledging the feeling without surrendering your own perspective. "I can see why it might feel that way," or "I understand that this is frustrating for you." That small shift, a few words carefully chosen, does something extraordinary. It interrupts the reactive rhythm. It removes the need for the other person to escalate, and it signals that their feelings are being recognized. Once a person feels heard, their mind softens, their posture relaxes, and the space for reason to enter expands naturally. There is a quiet power in acknowledging emotions before introducing logic. Logic without empathy often feels like a weapon. Empathy without understanding is empty. Epictetus once said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." In the context of disagreements, this is precisely what happens. People are disturbed not by your words, but by the meaning they assign to them. Recognizing that allows you to step into a different mode entirely. You are no longer engaged in a duel of statements. You are observing, listening, and subtly guiding the conversation toward insight. Validation is not capitulation. It is removing the emotional barrier that blocks constructive exchange. By acknowledging what is felt before what is argued, you create a foundation where clarity can arise without provoking defensiveness. Even when emotions are addressed, there is another layer to consider. Sometimes an argument persists, not because someone believes they are objectively right, but because admitting they were wrong threatens their identity. Pride can anchor a position more strongly than any evidence. Once a person has publicly taken a stance, retracting it feels like a loss of self. Socrates once said, "He is richest who is content with the least, for content is the wealth of nature." In this context, contentment is not about accepting the other's perspective. It is about reducing the need to demonstrate superiority in every exchange. By recognizing the role of pride, you can understand why arguments can continue long after the factual dispute has been resolved. It is a battle over image rather than insight, a struggle to preserve dignity rather than a search for truth. The beauty of addressing emotion first is that it simultaneously opens the door for discussion and removes unnecessary conflict. Instead of proving yourself correct, you create a space where the other person no longer feels the need to fight. This approach transforms the conversation into a joint exploration rather than a contest of wills. Observing the way pride and validation influence interactions can illuminate patterns in your own responses. You begin noticing the triggers that provoke defensiveness, the moments when a reaction is automatic, and the small opportunities to intervene deliberately. Self-awareness becomes the foundation of influence, allowing you to act rather than react, to guide rather than dominate, and to preserve peace without sacrificing clarity. Once someone feels understood, their resistance diminishes naturally. You do not need to overwhelm with counter-arguments or flood the room with evidence. Calm listening creates a psychological shift. The other person feels respected, their mind relaxes, and the argument often softens on its own. It is a subtle, almost imperceptible redirection of energy, but it is profoundly effective. Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." In conversations, wasting energy in defensive arguments is one of the easiest ways to deplete mental and emotional resources. When you focus on listening first, responding second, and understanding throughout, the time spent is productive, the interaction constructive, and the relationship preserved. There is also an important strategic element. Arguments rarely resolve if one person is trying to avoid looking wrong. When someone's self-image is at stake, they cling to their position even when they internally recognize its flaws. Understanding the psychological stakes of an argument is a form of wisdom. When you perceive that the real battle is not over facts, but over self-perception, you can choose how and when to respond. You are no longer participating blindly in a fight. You are observing the terrain, identifying motives, and selecting your actions with deliberate care. The conversation ceases to be a test of who is cleverer and becomes an opportunity to maintain stability, clarity, and composure. The transformation occurs when you shift from defending to understanding, from reacting to observing, and from proving to guiding. Once emotions are acknowledged and pride is respected, arguments lose their urgency. People begin to listen instead of attack. Words cease to be weapons and become tools for clarity. The conversation moves forward without unnecessary tension, and both parties find a place where insight can emerge. In this space, disagreement no longer feels threatening. Instead, it becomes manageable, productive, and even illuminating. The subtle power of validation before logic, observation before reaction, and awareness before defense reshapes every interaction, and it is here, in this quiet discipline, that real control and influence begin. Human beings guard their dignity with an intensity that often surprises even those closest to them. It is woven into the very fabric of how we navigate the world. If someone feels cornered or forced to admit a mistake, the instinctive reaction is rarely a calm acknowledgement. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because the mind is wired to protect identity. The threat of public embarrassment or perceived weakness triggers an almost automatic defense. You can see it in small ways: a tightened jaw, a quick rebuttal, a refusal to look at the other person. It is subtle, yet powerful, and it completely shifts the dynamics of any conversation. One simple phrase like "you're wrong" carries far more weight than the words themselves. Even delivered politely, it can make someone's focus pivot entirely from the subject at hand to defending their own sense of self. The priority ceases to be clarity, solution, or truth, and becomes instead self-preservation. But there is a path that avoids this trap without sacrificing your own perspective. Instead of confronting directly, you can gently invite reflection by showing that you once held a similar view. A simple, "I used to see it that way too until I noticed something interesting," opens a door. It reframes the conversation. Suddenly, you are not above them, you are beside them. Both of you were once in the same place of understanding. The difference is not presented as superiority, but as shared discovery. That subtle shift diffuses defensive energy and allows for reconsideration without threatening pride. Epictetus once said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." The reaction to challenge, not the challenge itself, determines the tone of the conversation. By framing disagreement as exploration rather than correction, you preserve dignity on both sides while still steering toward insight. Still, patience and empathy are not guarantees that every disagreement will resolve itself. Some people cling to their stance for reasons deeper than logic or emotion. Their identity is intertwined with their position. Trying to force them to change or confront them aggressively almost always backfires. It risks escalating tension, triggering deeper defensiveness, or permanently closing channels of communication. In these moments, knowing when to redirect the discussion becomes crucial. Rather than continuing a dialogue that reinforces resistance, the skilled communicator shifts focus. This can mean addressing a different aspect of the topic, inviting them to consider a broader perspective, or even pausing entirely to allow reflection. Marcus Aurelius once said, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." The principle extends to conversations. It is often wiser to preserve the relationship and the possibility of influence than to force immediate agreement. One practical method of preserving dignity is subtle alignment with shared values. Instead of negating an idea, you can connect with elements of it that are valid or admirable. For instance, if someone proposes a plan you disagree with, acknowledge the intent behind it, the care, effort, or reasoning that motivated it. By validating the person's purpose, you reduce the instinct to defend while still creating an opening to introduce alternative perspectives. Seneca once said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." Most of the tension in arguments is created in anticipation or projection of judgment rather than in the actual content. By addressing emotion before logic, you dissolve imagined threats and lower resistance, making real understanding possible. Ultimately, the mastery of conversation lies not in proving others wrong, but in cultivating an environment where ideas can be exchanged without ego interference. The skill is subtle. requiring observation, reflection, and a willingness to prioritize dignity over immediate victory. By applying patience, acknowledging emotion first, and framing differences as shared exploration rather than confrontation, the dialogue becomes a tool for influence rather than conflict. This approach preserves relationships, opens minds, and allows for the quiet integration of ideas. Over time, these practices create a rhythm where disagreements no longer escalate and influence grows without force. In this way, patience, empathy, and understanding become the instruments of true conversational power, guiding interactions toward insight while safeguarding dignity and respect. Imagine two colleagues caught in a heated discussion over strategy. One insists the plan is too risky. The other argues that it is necessary. The voices rise, interruptions occur, and the air thickens with frustration. This is a familiar scene in offices, families, and even among friends, yet a single, calm question can reset everything. Let's step back for a second. What outcome are we both trying to achieve? The focus moves away from ego and toward purpose. The conversation now revolves around results, not superiority. Defensive walls begin to lower because the discussion is no longer about who is right. It is about what works best. The dynamic changes from confrontation to collaboration, and what initially seemed adversarial becomes a shared exploration. Marcus Aurelius once said, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." When perspective shifts, the argument often loses its force without a single point being conceded. Using silence effectively requires patience and awareness. It is not avoidance, and it is not submission. It is the deliberate choice to let the emotional current settle before introducing thought or guidance. In this space, insight becomes possible. The conversation is no longer dictated by reactive impulses, but by conscious intention. This practice is particularly valuable when dealing with people whose pride or emotional investment is high. Rather than attempting to overpower them with reason or argument, you allow reflection to occur, giving their mind time to encounter their own inconsistencies or unexamined motives. Often, the pressure to respond immediately is a product of anticipation rather than necessity. Silence lets reality catch up with expectation. When reframing and silence are combined, the effect is magnified. A well-timed question can redirect focus, while a pause can diffuse tension long enough for rational thought to emerge. The person across from you is no longer trapped in the emotional loop that drives most conflicts. They begin to think instead of react, to consider instead of oppose. This is the essence of influence without force. It is not about dominating the conversation or proving a point. It is about creating conditions where insight, understanding, and cooperation can flourish naturally. Observing not only your own impulses, but the emotional rhythms of the discussion allows you to act with clarity and restraint, shaping the dialogue rather than being shaped by it. Ultimately, mastery in dialogue is achieved not through dominance, but through subtle guidance. Reframing discussions and applying silence create a rhythm where arguments lose momentum and understanding grows. Defensive walls fall naturally when focus is on shared objectives rather than personal victory. People begin to listen, not out of obligation, but because the environment you cultivate encourages thought over reaction. The conversation becomes a space for reflection and clarity, not for prideful assertion. Each disagreement becomes an opportunity to recognize the currents of ego, emotion, and perception, to adjust your own responses, and to guide the dialogue toward resolution. By mastering the art of reframing and the power of silence, influence is exercised without confrontation, and interactions shift from conflict to cooperation, quietly and profoundly. Silence is far more powerful than most people give it credit for, yet it is often deeply misunderstood. Many believe that remaining quiet makes them appear weak, as if failing to respond immediately is the same as conceding defeat. The truth is the opposite. Calm silence can carry more authority than 100 arguments. The moment someone provokes you and you respond instantly, you have already surrendered control. Their words have pushed a button inside you, and your reaction confirms it. But when you pause, when you allow that brief interval to stretch just a little longer, the dynamic changes entirely. The energy in the room shifts. The conversation loses its frantic rhythm. The other person, faced with your restraint, often begins filling the space themselves. They clarify their own words, soften their tone, and sometimes even reconsider the assumptions behind what they said. It is in this space that influence quietly emerges, without a single raised voice or pointed retort. Silence interrupts the cycle of conflict because it forces time into the exchange. When both parties are rushing to assert themselves, logic is drowned out by emotion, and conversations spiral into defensiveness. By simply pausing, you create a gap where reasoning can enter, where reflection can occur, and where composure can guide the next step. Marcus Aurelius once said, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it." In silence, you prevent the immediate flare of anger from taking over, and in doing so, you reduce the likelihood that the conversation will leave lasting damage. The person who learns to remain quiet in the face of provocation gains a subtle authority. They are no longer pushed around by circumstance or emotion. Instead, they shape the exchange through restraint and attention. Silence is not emptiness, it is presence, it is observation, and it is a form of unspoken power that few ever use deliberately. Yet silence is not simply about waiting. It is an active practice that requires awareness and intentionality. Stoics understood this deeply. They cultivated the ability to pause before reacting, to allow reason to emerge after the initial surge of emotion. Epictetus once said, "There is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will." In conversation, silence becomes the vehicle for this principle. You focus not on controlling what the other person says, but on regulating your own responses. You maintain equilibrium while observing the interplay of words, tone, and subtle emotional cues. This deliberate pause transforms what could have been a reactive exchange into a measured dialogue. The room grows quieter, and the conversation often follows, because your calm has interrupted the usual rhythm of escalation. Even with mastery of silence, it is important to recognize that not every situation is resolvable. Some conflicts persist, no matter how disciplined or patient you are. Others will not shift because the other person is invested in defending an idea or identity at any cost. Accepting that some arguments are unwinnable is a cornerstone of calm influence. It is a recognition that control is not in forcing agreement, but in managing your own state of mind. You may not convince everyone, and you may not resolve every dispute, but you can protect your composure, maintain your dignity, and preserve your energy. The act of remaining silent in these moments is not surrender. It is choosing wisely where to invest your attention and influence. Silence, practiced consistently, subtly changes the landscape of every relationship and interaction. When others realize that their provocations no longer elicit immediate reactions, they begin to approach conversations differently. They pause, reconsider, and often moderate their tone without any overt instruction. The power of this approach lies not in domination, but in the quiet establishment of boundaries. It signals that you are grounded, that your equilibrium cannot be easily disturbed, and that emotional manipulation or rash challenges will no longer dictate your behavior. Seneca once said, "He who is brave is free." Silence is a form of bravery in social interaction, a freedom from the tyranny of immediate impulse, and a means to exert control without aggression. This approach also has a profound impact on your own mental state. Reacting instantly keeps you trapped in cycles of emotion, frustration, anger, and resentment long after the conversation ends. By embracing silence, you create space for reflection, preventing escalation both in the moment and afterward. The practice strengthens emotional resilience, allowing you to choose responses that align with your principles rather than with transient feelings. It is a disciplined pause that enhances clarity, focus, and strategic thinking. Aristotle once said, "Knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom." In conversation, silence is a tool for self-knowledge, allowing you to notice triggers, recognize patterns, and respond deliberately rather than reactively. Finally, the subtle power of silence extends beyond immediate conflicts. It influences how people perceive you over time. Those who respond with calm restraint are not seen as timid or weak. They are seen as deliberate, measured, and reliable. Their words carry weight, not because of volume, but because of timing and precision. They cultivate an aura of stability that reshapes interactions before they even begin. The strategic use of silence, combined with careful observation and thoughtful engagement, allows you to navigate conversations with far greater control. It teaches patience, preserves relationships, and creates influence without confrontation. Plato once said, "Wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something." In mastering the art of silence, you join those who speak with intention and act with presence, guiding discussions not through force, but through the quiet authority of restraint and understanding. Some people are not actually looking for understanding. They are looking for opposition. They are driven by the need to assert themselves, to challenge, to control the rhythm of the conversation rather than to engage in exploration. You've likely encountered someone like this. No matter how carefully you phrase your thoughts, how calmly you explain, or how patient you remain, they push back. Every discussion turns into a debate. Every disagreement becomes a performance. It is exhausting because you cannot win by logic alone. Trying to convince them can feel like talking to a wall, and the more effort you invest, the more resistance seems to arise. It is in these moments that the usual rules of conversation no longer apply. The person you are engaging with has already decided that disagreement is more important than insight. Reacting to them with your usual tactics only feeds the cycle, reinforcing tension and drawing you into unnecessary conflict. The solution, counterintuitive as it may seem, is to withdraw your energy, not out of fear, not out of submission, but as a deliberate choice to preserve your calm and focus. You do not need to correct every misunderstanding. You do not need to explain every decision. You do not need to justify your life choices to someone who has already made up their mind. Calm detachment becomes the most potent form of influence. When you acknowledge another person's perspective politely and then choose not to engage further in proving yourself, you maintain control of your mind while releasing the tension that drives conflict. Seneca once said, "We are more often frightened than hurt, and we suffer more from imagination than from reality." In this case, the imagination of conflict, the anticipation of argument, is more exhausting than the reality of the exchange. By stepping back, you remove yourself from the drama without losing integrity. The benefits of this approach are subtle but profound. When you stop investing energy in battles that cannot be won, something shifts. Your conversations become quieter. Others may continue to push, but their attempts are less effective because you are no longer reacting impulsively. The dynamic changes from confrontation to observation. You notice patterns in how people attempt to provoke, and you learn where your own triggers lie. Calm detachment does not mean you stop caring or stop engaging entirely. It means you choose where engagement is meaningful. Time, attention, and emotional energy are finite resources. Allocating them wisely allows you to focus on discussions that matter, decisions that matter, and relationships that matter. In effect, the less you expend on unnecessary conflict, the stronger your influence becomes. As this practice develops, people begin to notice. They notice that your words carry weight not because of volume or intensity, but because of measured intention. They notice that attempts to provoke you no longer succeed in eliciting a reaction. You become difficult to manipulate, difficult to anger, and difficult to distract. This is a quiet authority, not one imposed by dominance, but earned through composure. Carl Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In this context, making the darkness conscious means recognizing the emotional currents, the pride-driven provocations, and the triggers that others attempt to exploit. Once you see them clearly, you no longer need to fight them. You respond with awareness, not reflex, and in doing so, the other person's ability to control the conversation diminishes naturally. Withdrawing your energy is also a strategic investment in your own well-being. Engaging endlessly with people who thrive on opposition drains vitality, focus, and patience. It depletes mental resources that could be directed toward creation, problem-solving, and personal growth. Marcus Aurelius once said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Here, the obstacle is not the other person's words themselves, but the impulse to react to them. By redirecting your attention, by refusing to give power to their provocation, you transform what could have been a drain into an opportunity. The energy saved can be used to influence situations where reasoning, patience, and dialogue can actually make a difference. The distinction between expendable conflict and meaningful engagement becomes clearer with practice. This approach does not require manipulation or deceit. It is rooted in presence, self-awareness, and understanding of human behavior. You are not ignoring the other person. You are recognizing the futility of certain confrontations and choosing to preserve energy and clarity. It is a form of mastery over oneself, not over others. The person who practices this becomes increasingly resilient. They are able to navigate conflicts calmly, even when provoked, and can maintain focus on meaningful objectives rather than being drawn into unnecessary battles. Over time, as this discipline is integrated into daily interactions, the effect compounds. People approach conversations with you differently. They notice a steadiness that is rare, a quiet presence that does not react to every provocation. You do not need to argue to be respected. You do not need to escalate to be heard. Your calmness shapes the environment and shifts the dynamics of dialogue naturally. By withdrawing energy strategically, you preserve not only your peace of mind, but also your ability to act with intention. Observing the provocations of others and choosing where to invest your energy becomes a tool for self-knowledge, influence, and effective communication. Over time, these choices create a presence that is both unshakable and quietly compelling, allowing you to navigate social interactions with a strength that does not need to raise its voice. Over time, this discipline begins to shape the way people perceive you in ways that are subtle yet profound. When someone rarely engages in arguments, when they do speak, it is heard more carefully, more thoughtfully. Words carry weight not because of volume, but because of consistency and calm authority. When you maintain composure under pressure, your presence itself begins to stabilize the environment around you. People instinctively adjust to your steadiness, even if they do not consciously recognize it. Carl Jung once said, "In all chaos there is a cosmos, in all disorder a secret order." By cultivating calm amidst the chaos of conflict, you become a living example of that hidden order. Conversations that once spiraled into tension now take on a different rhythm, one shaped by observation, reflection, and quiet influence. As this pattern continues, the effect extends beyond individual conversations. People begin to seek your perspective instead of confrontation. They bring problems to you rather than arguments, questions instead of disputes. This is the subtle authority earned through restraint, a type of influence that does not demand attention, but commands it naturally. Understanding your own reactions, recognizing when to step back, and consistently choosing calm over agitation builds a reputation that others intuitively trust. They see that you are not easily manipulated, not easily drawn into unnecessary battles, and that your focus remains on solutions rather than proving a point. This quiet competence encourages cooperation and mutual respect in ways that loud argumentation never can. The discipline of choosing peace over victory also enhances emotional clarity. When you refuse to react impulsively, you gain time to consider what is truly important, what merits engagement, and what can be allowed to pass without consequence. Decisions are made with intention rather than reaction. Conflicts are assessed for their significance rather than their emotional charge. This clarity reduces stress, conserves energy, and prevents the entanglement that so often accompanies reactive argumentation. By intentionally stepping back from unnecessary arguments, you prevent imagined conflicts from dictating your emotional state, preserving mental and emotional resources for situations where deliberate action is meaningful and productive. As your steadiness becomes recognized, people begin to approach you differently. They speak more cautiously, consider your perspective more openly, and are more likely to collaborate than to compete. The environment you create becomes calmer, more constructive, and less prone to conflict. Relationships gradually improve not through persuasion or force, but through the consistent demonstration of patience, restraint, and rational composure. Observing interactions without reacting impulsively provides insight not only into the motivations of others, but into your own patterns, allowing growth and refinement in how you engage with the world. The discipline of calmness becomes a mirror for self-awareness, creating influence without aggression and change without confrontation. The ultimate effect of this practice is transformative. You become a stabilizing force, someone whose presence encourages reflection, measured dialogue, and thoughtful problem-solving. People instinctively know that attempts to provoke or control will not succeed, and they adjust accordingly. The energy that once fueled endless arguments is redirected toward productive exchanges, toward shared objectives, and toward relationships built on respect and trust. Choosing peace over victory is not a sign of weakness. It is the hallmark of strength. It requires observation, self-control, and the willingness to prioritize long-term stability over short-term triumph. Each moment of restraint reinforces the pattern, and the cumulative effect is profound. You are not defensive. You are not reactive. You are steady. Your presence becomes a quiet authority, a stabilizing factor in interactions that might otherwise have spiraled into conflict. The discipline shapes not only conversations, but your reputation, relationships, and inner life. The world responds not to force or aggression, but to calm, reasoned influence. And in mastering this discipline, you harness a power that many overlook, yet few ever achieve. This is the subtle art of remaining grounded, of choosing composure, and of cultivating influence through serenity and deliberate presence. Mastering the art of calm, of choosing peace over victory, is not about avoiding life, it's about shaping it. When you respond with steadiness instead of reaction, you protect your mind, preserve your energy, and quietly influence the world around you. Every conversation becomes an opportunity for understanding, every challenge a chance to practice restraint, and every moment of calm builds the foundation of a stronger, wiser self. If you let these principles take root, you'll notice something extraordinary. People listen more, resist less, and your life begins to move with a rhythm you control, not one dictated by chaos or conflict. Take a moment now and watch one of the videos on your screen to continue strengthening this practice.